You are listening to a discussion born in the Christian Ghetto.
There we go. My mic is on. Excellent. At least I hope. Yes, it looks like I'm talking now. Very good. We're just waiting for a few people to show up. I am going to put the article in question into the comments, so those that haven't read it can do so at their leisure. We're just waiting for hopefully a couple people to show up. Where is it here? Please bear with me and be patient as we get this thing going. All right, there's the piece. Copy. And now let's open it up. And I'm going to put on, okay, let's see here. All right, I'm going to drop this post. There's so this was the article in question that caused Auron to reach out and invite me, ask me if I wanted to be on a show, which of course, who would turn that down? And let's see who else is coming in. I'm waiting for someone in, hopefully Black Horse. He said he would be putting the kids to bed and be here around 10. And I expect that should be the case. Anyways, so we get into Elul, and one of the things that we talked about, and Auron talked about, sort of, why Elul? What makes Elul important for understanding the administrative state as opposed to, say, a Burnham or Francis, and what makes Elul unique in this regard, and do you really need to read him? And one of the things that Elul does is he gives you, as we said on Auron's stream, what Elul does is he gives you in some ways, the source code for much of what we see in modernity. So many things grew up together, and we arrive at the present moment, and many of the things that we see seem like corruptions of something else, but a lot of what we see today are really outworkings of a few basic ideas. And one of those very powerful ideas, at least at the time it was very compelling, is this idea of human progress. And this is in many ways the essential liberal idea. So we come back in terms of liberal ideas down to core myths. And the reason why you get back at core myths is because these myths drive a whole lot of other things. And so with the breakup of the Catholic and the Protestant churches, driven in part by the merchant classes who in many ways were chafing under the authority of the church, but also under the authority of the noble classes. So they wanted basically the freedom to make money. And there were a number of ancillary pieces. One of that is knowledge and learning, and the other is science and technology. And so you put rationalization, so this knowledge and learning piece, together with scientific learning and technology, together with making money, or the desire to make money, the merchant classes. Oh, there's Black Horse. All right, I'm going to invite to speak, and I will invite to co-host. There we go. Excellent. All right. I think did the invite come, Black Horse? Well, we'll find out soon, I guess. As I was saying, we'll kind of continue on for now. So what you end up with then with these kind of three pieces is a collection of myths that sort of build up. One of the myths is sort of the myth of what we might call history or progress. The other is the myth of, believe it or not, work. We take for granted, this whole idea of the Protestant work ethic. We take the idea of work for granted. But one of the things that Ellul works through in the technological society is that up until the modern era, work was not seen as kind of redemptive the way that we do. That you find basically you worked as hard as you needed to, and if you didn't need to work, you didn't work. And it wasn't that people were lazy; it's just that there were other things that concerned them. So then there was also the cult of youth. There's the pursuit of science and knowledge. But the big piece was the belief in history and progress. So there was this belief together that by applying yourself to knowledge, science, technique, technology, and to organization in and around the trading of goods and the merchant classes, making things, selling things, that all of this together would lead society to better and better and better places all the time, that we as human beings were progressing. And it was, the early 1700s was a very optimistic time. And so people grappled onto this, and it was not hard to see why. It was a time of great social plasticity after the end of the Reformation and the religious wars. People were tired of this. They were looking for other things, and they were looking to throw off the church. In many ways, had earned a lot of the scorn that it was facing, and so people threw this off, and they began to embrace these things. Then you get the lead up to the French and the American Revolutions, and
So, I mean, Ellul makes like a dozen plus of these claims, but there's a meta claim that sits underneath them, and that's the belief in the iterative reinvestment in cycle as the fundamental property, as the superordinate pursuit, right? So, in every one of these areas, what he's talking about when he's talking about the application of technique being inherently progressive, inherently universalizing, about the fact that if you take a process and apply it through infinite iterations, the ultimate will be no matter what the start you begin with.
Well, and that's in a sense the scientific principle, right? So you develop a theory, a postulate, you develop an experiment to test it, then you test it, your hypothesis is proven correct or incorrect, and at which point you modify the experiment, and then you learn things and you continue with this process. And part of what they did,
and if you run enough iterations, if you run that's a theory, right?
That's right.
And I think Ellul would conclude that if you run enough iterations of any of these technical systems, you will arrive at the inevitable end state of the technical system that you began with. And he would argue that the administrative state, or even the sort of capitalist rise, has like an inherently utopian, will make infinite widgets kind of feel to it. So
exactly,
that inherent utopianism drives and work ethic. Like all items here are actually downstream consequences of this fundamental claim. And I think that the fundamental claim that the technical process is utopian, universalizing. Utopian is very easy. Like the argument is a very straight line. Universalizing, I think, relatively straight.
And
Right.
and that's in a sense the technical imperative in many ways. Like Ellul makes the argument, like in some ways, the hope is that the solution will just kind of arrive on its own. You don't really worry about the results so much, because if there's problems, you just go back to the drawing board to figure out what the problems were, and then you put in the next level of technology, the next level of systems, the next new thing, and that new thing will fix then some of the problems that you have at this level, right? And the system continues to grow and grow and grow. It gets more and more sophisticated, more and more powerful, and the promise is that if you keep going on forever, that eventually you will arrive at, we have managed to manage everything into a state of perfection. And you see this in our modern day elites. Like, they really do still believe this, that we can still, as you say, iterate ourselves into perfection.
A great example of this is the quest to explain human consciousness through algorithmic as an emergent property of a series of algorithms we don't understand. Right. And we could only just kind of work through all the algorithms that operate in our consciousness, then we would fully understand human psychology and we'd be done with it.
Well, or even that the sense is that, because again, you have this belief in the directionality of history, you develop this, the whole question of, well, how did we get here if there wasn't a God? So you come up with this story called evolution, and then you explain all of these things. And the one thing that's very, very hard to explain is human consciousness. So the idea is, again, if you have all of these genetic changes and you iterate them over time, that eventually consciousness just emerges. So AI then becomes, in some ways, the scientific experiment to prove.
That's right.
To prove evolution.
That an emergent property of algorithms operating on a biological computer, right? That's the reason why AI is such a fixation, is because if you can create it, then you can demonstrate in their worldview conclusively that consciousness is this kind of illusion of meat computers.
Yeah, and that if we could do it with computers, then we know for certain that, or the postulate can be that it's highly probable that this is what happened genetically and biologically, right? So we did it with computers, and so this must be what had happened with biology.
Yeah. So that, I think the argument that it's universalizing is, you can make strongly because of the quest to, the proper Western scientific theory has attempted to explain every phenomenon is in a good and seeks a unified theory, good kind of explanation, a good piece of evidence that his ideas of technique are see this in the modern state. With each iteration of reinvestment attempts to accumulate more and more to itself, right? There's a universalizing principle.
Well, and this this works across all of culture and society. So this is why you have the quest for globalism. Again, like you said, the unifying theory in physics between, the quantum and Newtonian mechanics, and then and relativity. But you also see it in just the practices for everything. You're looking for always the one single best way to do everything, right? So this is what Ellul calls monism. So you're always on this quest to find the one perfect thing. A really good example of this was the COVID regime. people, said, well, it's about curing the virus. And I'm thinking, like, if you read Ellul, it's not about, stopping the virus, curing the virus. It's about developing the system. So this is just simply iteration number 1, right? And so now you have a whole bunch of data on what worked and didn't work, and they will go back to the drawing board, and they're just itching for the next round to come along so that they can try, the COVID policy 2.0. And then there'll be COVID policy 3.0. And this is just kind of the way it works until they are satisfied that they have reached, the best practices for COVID management. That's why there's no apologies. There's nobody's held responsible, because why would you hold people responsible? We're just, hey, we're in the process of developing. It's all, results don't matter. It's all about the process. And anytime you hear somebody say, well, we've got to have good process, and you're like, I constantly now push back on that and say, like, no. Even if the process is a hot mess, what really matters is that we get the results that we want. Oh, there we go. Okay. And yes, I think Black Horse was having some. Were you having some connection problems?
And then
it was definitely not intentional.
So, but before we get to the conclusions here, it's worth taking a minute to sort of dwell in the implications of. So, let's say, for the sake of the space, that technical mechanism of thinking has as its consequence a utopian and universalizing set of iterations.
Yeah, I think you're cutting. Yeah, yeah.
Is that better?
You're cutting in and out a fair bit, Black Horse.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know whether it's your Wi-Fi or the phone or whatever, but it's just it has been cutting out a bit. So, unfortunately,
maybe this will be a bit better. Sure.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's okay.
Yes, obviously Twitter's spaces need further iterative development. I guess to fill in the space then, that one of the things that we see, and I think where Black Horse was heading with this in some ways, is we have to understand that the system that we have today is not separate from the ideas that gave birth to sort of the whole complex of liberal ideas, whether it's economic liberalism, whether it's political liberalism, and we even talk about it in the classical sense, that all of these ideas grew up together. Like the very idea that you could, say, approach governance of a nation and develop a constitution and then sort of have a new founding for society is an inherently technical idea, right? But it's also then part of a belief in this progressive liberal idea at the same time. So the system and all of its architecture grows at the same time. Can
we slow down here?
Sure.
So can you hear me better now,
yes,
first of all?
Very much so.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
So, I think we've established 3 basic insights. First, that technical thinking is inherently progressive, inherently utopian, inherently universalizing. Second, that the that the mechanisms of government in which we're presently operating, liberal democracy as an idea, these are not only liberal democracy, but also the other fundamental mechanisms of our society, things like the way that the corporate world is architected, or the way that we think about science, are inherently technical mechanisms. And we can conclude from that these institutions, as presently constituted, have an inherent progressive bias over an infinite number of iterations.
Yes, and that's absolutely correct. And this is an insight that Ellul also noted, because we're on Twitter here, so a lot of this is about messaging, right? So Ellul argued that propaganda, it always has to align with the core myths of the people that you're dealing with, right? So if our core myths are all progressive, the messages that are most likely to adhere to people and to convince people are inherently progressive messaging. And this is why, you basically, our political parties are all variations of different kinds of progressive ideology. A truly conservative opinion really has no purchase, because when you say to people you need to sacrifice, you need to, you know what I mean, it just doesn't fly the same way as infinite progress does.
Yeah, well, so you're going to get a couple of questions from the broad public when you make this case. The first question is, okay, so science, technology, governance, the way that corporate entities are organized, these are inherently progressive expressions of techness. What's not an expression of techness, to understand the definition by contrast?
Okay.
Well, so you would look at things that are inherently not iterative, that are inherently not perfecting, right?
In some ways, or they're developed and perfected differently, right? So they would be things that are organic. They would be things that would be embedded in cultural memory. So they are the kind of things that do in some ways develop over time, but they develop over time in the practices of people within a community, right? So it's the long time taboos, the long time practice. Like, why do we do this thing this way? Well, this is the way we've always been doing it. Well, why are we always doing it this way? Well, because over time, practice had dictated that this is the best way to do it for our community, and that's the type of thing. Right. It's not abstracted.
So what you're talking about here is cultural memory, cultural myth are not technic in Ellul's definition, right? Feudal bonds of family, bonds of loyalty that are generational in nature are not technic in this sense, right?
That's correct. That's right.
Okay, so we've got tradition, mythology, we've got these kind of unchosen deep bonds as our alternative structure, and we have the idea of the craftsman.
That's right.
Which is, rather than a process-oriented method of construction, you've got a skill-oriented method of construction. The difference between a blacksmith and an industrial forge.
Well, and you also, though, have personal action and accountability. So, if I'm put in charge of something, so the king instructs me.
This is a great point.
The king instructs me to manage his affairs on the estate, right? So I do this personally with my own skill and ability. I am directly involved in it. So if the estate is poorly managed, the king isn't looking to the systems. He's not looking to rejig the policies. I lose my title and my family's destitute. And I probably lose my head as well, too, right? That's the type of thing.
Well, yeah, but inherently it's judgment that is the factor that's not...
That's right, personal judgment and ability and skill.
And then the other element that is kind of touched on there is judgment as an element of justice.
Yes.
Rather than the logical conclusion of technical thinking in justice is a perfecting system, which is a system, which is why you have corrections officers rather than jailers.
That's right. And it's abstracted, right? So that was the one thing we talked about with Auron is you take, so what technique wants to do is it looks at this system. So let's take, for example, the estate of the Lord, right? So right now you've got a guy in charge. He's the estate master, and he manages everything by his skill, ability, intention. Some of it is, he was probably apprenticed from other estate managers, so he's picked up sort of the right way to do it from community. So some guy comes in, Taylor's time and motion studies, right? He comes in, he watches how it's done, and he looks at it. Then he goes back and he rationalizes, he breaks it all down. What works, what doesn't work, and then he develops a system and a plan that is then separate from the people, and he then presents it back to it and said, like, okay, here's the plan in the system, and now no longer is it the ability of the person, but the person is now fitting into the system. So in a sense, the system governs. It's in a sense the same way the rule of law, the rule of system, the rule of policy. They're all basically variations on the same theme.
But this gets to the other key note on the way through. Virtually all historical systems are some combination of techness and non-technical solutions. So if you look at Roman governance as an example, all Roman cities are laid out in exactly the same way.
Yes.
There's technical thinking there.
Yes, exactly.
There's technical thinking in taxation. There's technical thinking in the way that they do the census. Mm-hmm. There's also a deep history of non-technical thinking. There's personal accountability as the foundational principle of government, right? The governor governs according to his judgment, not according to any governing system, and is judged based on his ability to extract maximum tax revenue from a province. And then there's traditions about what percentage of that he gets to keep versus what has to go to the emperor or whatever.
Yes.
So most historical governance systems are some combination of techness and non-technical thinking.
Yes, but then, a lot of the technique though at that time it's less abstracted and more, in a sense, cultural. So they work these things out over time.
This gets to the other fundamental point, though.
Yeah.
Technical thinking because it is progressive and because it is universalizing, kind of grows like a cancer.
Yes.
So if you rewound society to 1800 and looked at it, you would find a great deal less technical thinking and a great deal more other forms of thought. And if you fast forward society from there to 1900, you'll find more technical thinking and less personal accountability. You fast forward again to today, you'll find almost no personal accountability and almost only technical thinking.
Exactly.
Really, the only places you'll find personal accountability are outside the West or in entrepreneurship.
That's right.
Or in places where something has radically changed recently. So like Silicon Valley is a great place. It's a great example of there's technical thinking there, but there's also these figures that emerge that are fundamentally personally accountable in a way that very few figures anywhere else in our society are. And they emerge because they create a new environment that's not technical, and it gradually gets conquered by the technocracy.
Yes. At the same time, it's still inherently technical because what they're dealing with is, so they're technological disruptors.
Right, but the point I'm trying to make, Cryptos, is that these are mixed environments.
Yes, exactly.
Whereas, like the environment of, say, the DMV is 100% technical in its thinking. There's no judgment at all.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's exactly it. That's right.
Whereas you have mixed environments at the fringes, where things are changing.
Yes.
And I would argue that if you did a historical study, you would find that disruption is the ingredient that. So you talked about the process of technical thinking gradually subsuming previously personal bonds. Like when you talked about breaking down the feudal estate into a system that is abstracted from personal bonds. Well, how do you go the other direction is the question. Because if you're in an environment of modernity where technical thinking dominates everything, how do you turn the knob in the other direction? I think the answer to it is fairly obvious. The answer is disruption.
Yes,
so
you unplug in some way.
Well, so if you look at Silicon Valley as an example of turning from 100% technical thinking to, 95% technical thinking or 80% technical thinking, what you're looking at is, to the extent that a disruption is made to the way that to the landscape of industry, that disruption reduces the proportion of technical thinking and creates an opportunity for personal judgment, right?
Yes.
So every time a disruption of that kind occurs, there's an opportunity for a figure to insert himself. And I would argue that technological disruptions are actually like the least good candidates for this. The best candidates for this are like civil disruptions.
Yes. So that gets back to the whole thing of revolt. Now, two examples while you were talking come to mind. And one of the things I think that we need to mention, because technique and the system are totalizing, right? The desire is always to move up to economies of scale, right? So one of the cases that we look at is Bukele in Central America. I forget the country.
Yeah.
And people ask, well, why can't we do that here? Well, that country is a country of 6 million people. So what happens is then on that smaller scale, a lot of the kind of problems that you have when you have 340 million people don't occur. And the size of the U.S. bureaucracy at the federal level, and even oftentimes many times the state level. So he's able to.
Yeah. So if you rewind at a meta level, what you're talking about is is at whether scale has an impact as to whether technical systems or personal bonds are more effective in managing a state. So
and this would be, so if you're looking to say disruption, so the way to disrupt then would be to intentionally move back to smaller arrangements that would allow you to do things on a personal level, but to do so intentionally, right?
Yeah, well, fundamentally to smash the large units, and then know that if you reduce the scale at which you're operating, personal bonds stand a much better chance against the technical systems at the reduced scale. So if you were, for example, interested in restructuring the country of Canada and reducing the extent to which it's a technically dominated society, the first thing you would do is you would take all the regional divisions, you would amp them up to 11, and you would attempt to smash the country into constituent elements.
Yes,
and then you would figure that in some of those constituent elements, you might be able to introduce non-technical thinking.
Well, that's right. But at the same time, again, it comes back to one of the things. I mean, unless you go to the point where, like the end of modernity, right? And you could do like a 600 years of dark ages where basically technique is largely forgotten, right? Short of that type of scenario, you're going to have technique with you, right? So somebody somewhere is going to keep the knowledge, right?
This is what I was getting at here. Almost all systems are mixed systems. So the Alulian idea that you're going to go through a great darkness and expunge techness from the way that things are done.
Unlikely.
I think it's very unlikely and not even necessarily a good goal.
No. And that's really where, I mean, in the political illusion, he gets at that point, and really he comes back to the idea that that alternate communities are the way to go, right? That you build a parallel polity, and that is capable of resisting, the way he put it, resisting the rewards and the punishments of the regime. Right? It's a kind of danger, because he says as soon as you do that meaningfully, the regime will find you and it will want to stamp out that resistance. So you have to be prepared to deal with that.
Right? But that's a question for before you get sovereignty. And I think we all kind of know how to live effectively as a minority under a hostile sovereign. We've all kind of experienced that over the last 15, 20 years. The question is, what do you do? What are you attempting to do when you're attempting to grab sovereignty? And this is the question that's unresolved on the right. And yes. I think Alul's contribution is very valuable in looking at how to resolve it. Because
that's exactly
Alul's argument says that you don't... I mean, Alul would go as far as, like, smash modernity, eliminate technical thinking. What I would say is that actually there's a nice middle ground here where if you disrupt the iterative process badly enough, we could go back to, like, I don't know, 1850 levels of personal accountability in systems. And, you know, that worked pretty well for 100 years. That's not so bad.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's the thing though too, because I think it's John Michael Greer and Matthew Crawford. Both look at it this way, and I tend to like this idea that there is in this development process, out of the embedded, organic, communal, small, non-technique use of tools, to where we are today, that somewhere along this way there was an inflection point at which the primary thing was not the skill of human beings using tools as the decisive thing, to where the tools are in charge of us as human beings, right? So somewhere along the way there is a level of technology and a relationship with technology that allows us still to be the masters. And then, as you say, you just sort of, I don't know, it's like stop, but you have to sort of let go of this quote unquote development, growth, iterative,
I think
utopian kind of idea that we're always moving forward. That this is good enough.
Well, I think what you actually have to do is you have to acknowledge that the process is going to go forward, and you have to acknowledge that periodically you're going to have to reset it.
And that may be,
and it's going to have to be done probably violently every time.
Probably, yeah, because as I said to Auron, that given the fact that we live in a sinful world, if there is techniques that will allow somebody to gain power over other human beings, or if there are techniques that allow them to make money, you might be, and maybe we get like 90% of the world's communities to restrain themselves and agree, but there's going to be that one guy who says, like, screw it, I can get rich and powerful by using these techniques, I'm going to do it, and then the genie's out of the bottle again.
I mean, it's an inevitable process.
Yes.
And so the issue with the inevitable process is that at some point there's a negative return on continuing the process, but the logic can't be stopped. Right.
And this is what John Tainter says too, is that, and this is one of his, like, the collapse of complex civilizations in his book, is that he says eventually every society reaches a point where the societal inputs become greater than the outputs, and then eventually the whole thing either collapses or it has to be broken into pieces, and that's sort of the natural, and that was basically what happened with Rome. Is that the barbarian invasions just forced the breakup into smaller pieces. And at the time, on the ground level, people actually, he argued, welcomed the whole process because they were just suffocating under the Roman Empire at the end.
Well, I mean, whether they welcomed it or not, like, this is the inevitable process of
That's
history. If you look at China as another example of a state that, during the period between about 800 and about 1400, more like 400 to about 1200, before the arrival of Khan, was like incredibly stultified, accomplished almost nothing for like a several 100-year period because of this like just suffocating bureaucratic process that they had wrapped around the memory of the monarchy.
Well, and this is something that Spengler notes as well too. You're basically you're sort of a dead thing, just kind of keeping on. India had the same problem as well.
Yes, and so there's a reality here that hard resets are very uncomfortable, but they're part of a life cycle. It's like how the forest needs to burn down periodically. And the issue is, how do you burn down the forest without doing permanent damage, right? You want to do damage it just enough.
Well, and this is the thing. I think this is what I said to Auron. I said this is really the challenge with the court of, I mean, as a Gen Xer, everybody's favorite thing to do is to bash on boomers. But the boomer con phenomenon is a broader political phenomenon, is the idea that we can right society, make changes.
Yes.
We can fix everything, but it won't cost us anything. And it's that last bit. Yeah, things can get fixed and get better, but it's going to cost you. And if you don't want to pay the price, they aren't going to get fixed. And that's really right now why our politics feels blocked, is because
because there's this enormous price for changing
that's right.
it.
And nobody wants to pay it, or they don't think that they have to pay it.
Yeah, I mean, there's two very different groups. There's whether the boomers, such as they are, think they don't have to pay it, or just think that it's not worth it for the last 10 years of their life, is kind of an academic question. They still hold most of the wealth and most of the power in the Western world, and they're enormously invested in not changing it, even if it means putting a dead person in the White House.
Oh, right? Yeah, and Eugippius has noticed this for Germany as well, too. Much to his frustration. Like, he's just banged on that, constantly, how baby boomers completely run German politics. Totally.
Yeah, and this is going to change in the next 10 years. But and one of the things that's interesting is when you hand it over to the next generation, like we've done in Canada, in the short term, that's often, I mean, you experience a very unpleasant change. But at least the thing is alive again, instead of like just choked. Like, Canadian politics are fundamentally alive in a way American politics are not.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. Yes.
In 10 years, we're going to have a very different country in Canada, one for better or for worse. Whereas in 10 years, unless the hold of the Democrats can somehow be broken.
Well, in Canada, there's many of the same things happening, but there's a kind of political intentionality about it. Like, it's an actual functioning program. It isn't just.
But there's live politics on both sides, right?
That is true.
In Canada, there's like genuine movements to restructure sovereignty, to put it in the hands of one group or another.
That's right. The provinces, the workers, whatever.
Yeah, you have everything from communist revolutionaries to Quebec separatists to like whatever the hell you want to call the status quo.
Yeah.
Whereas like 90% of the genuinely powerful people in the United States are still invested in Team Red versus Team Blue.
That's right. And it was interesting and surprising a good example of this was the trucker protests, right?
Yeah.
So you had this is probably in the Western world the closest, maybe other than some of the stuff going on in France, for us, like actual real like Schmittian politics breaking out, friend enemy distinction, right?
Way more so than France, like genuine Carl Schmitt politics live on your TV screen,
Yeah, and what was interesting when you're looking at this, right? The fun question that you have in the States, like who's really an American, right?
Yeah.
In Canada, when you had a Punjabi trucker, you know what I mean, a Sikh trucker, dancing alongside of your basic, normal white working class trucker, and the two of them were like, and you listen to these guys talk, they were totally aligned there in that moment, and you're looking at it going like, wow, there is an existential bond, the kind of thing that Schmitt talks about, a shared existential interest that is threatened that they are willing to defend. And so they understand that there's a bond here politically, and it's shared, and they have a common enemy. And because they know who their friends are now, they now also know who their enemies. And you're like, wow, this is like really happening like in Canada.
Yeah, no, it's sort of fascinating. And I like, this is why I'm, infamously on Twitter, a very anti-Trump figure, because I think that throwing him in prison and throwing away the key causes politics to break out in the United States. And there's no, like, there are only two great hopes in my mind politically. The first is that the American empire becomes too incompetent to hold on to its vassals, and they all get to go free, which will help the people in Europe. It probably won't help us.
No, we are going to remain a vassal state. That's
for a very long time.
Proximity is not. Yeah.
For a very long time.
Yeah.
And the other hope is that genuine politics breaks out in America and they become a different kind of empire.
Well, you can see it regionalizing, like it breaking up, because, I mean, from the very beginning, like the colonies joining together, the United States sort of tips the game that from the get-go, you were creating an empire.
Yeah.
You were uniting 13 small countries, emergent infant countries, into one larger empire that was then, cemented in the Civil War and Reconstruction.
Yeah. Well, politics breaking out inside the empire politics breaking out inside empires historically is a very violent and very bloody process. So, you don't want to do it unless there's a very, very good reason to do it. But we're at a point with the way that the West is governed that there's an existential historic reason to do it.
Yeah. And this,
in
for
my
me,
mind, the burning of Notre Dame is this great symbol of it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And also like the church burnings in Canada are also a symbol of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, the Canadian churches that burned were somewhat less historically valuable. To
Notre Dame is itself yes, that's right. It's historical significance and as a symbol of the Christian faith and all it represented that way, right? Sort of as an anchor that way. It also, one of the things I think for people to understand, and this is one of the things that I do and have been developing in my Substack, is trying to get people to think of, okay, so a lot of the current game of politics that we look at, and this is something that you and I had discussed in writing that recent piece, what I realized that, when you talk about, elite replacement theory isn't going to happen, that what I was talking about was something, within the current system. Because if you have policy wonks replacing policy wonks, it doesn't matter. It's just like switching the channel on the TV, right? It's just different programming.
Yeah. Yeah, this is bring in Tony Blair or some other group of neoliberals.
Like Ron DeSantis is not solving anything. I'm sorry. It isn't going to do anything. Same thing too with the governor of California, whatever his name is, and
Well, but it does. The issue is it doesn't turn back the utopian nature, the utopian universalizing nature of the system.
No.
In order to turn the dial back on that, you need genuine disruption. So you need somebody who will go in and like wipe the slate clean to the federal departments.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, too, and this was something that Ellul notes regularly, right? So we have to begin thinking of societies are always organized around great mythic / religious ideas, right?
Well,
so up until modernity, the religious idea was the sort of the static architecture of the Christian faith, creation, fall, redemption. You're waiting. History is God's, and you're waiting for Christ's return, right?
Yeah.
And within that, we just basically do the best we can. We're not trying to perfect society. We're waiting for Christ to return, right? Yeah. Then you have this break, and now the great religious idea is progress, perfection of.
Well, and you can see this growing out of like the post millennial, like people have tried to link this to post millennial. What's the word for it?
Apocalypse.
Yeah.
Apocalyptic thinking.
I don't think and that kind of thinking has been like a dominant element of American religious thinking, going back as far as I can read American religious writing. But like, there's kind of two paths here that you can see. You can see like disruption light, which is politics breaks out in America, and you have somebody come to power in more or less the existing political unit of the United States,
and it limps on for a while.
Well, but you can have somebody who's not going to do anything, or you can have somebody who turns back the dial on progress by 100 years by wiping out the federal bureaucracy.
Like
right?
what Elon Musk did to Twitter. You just basically fired 98% of everybody in the government, and you just set them packing.
And you see this in corporate takeovers all the time. So it is very common for organizations to become like pre-Musk Twitter. So very famously, you've had this happen now twice at General Electric, where a large, very old organization, Jack Welch, comes in and like totally guts everything.
Just lays waste to it.
And makes a new company, which fundamentally has no relationship to the GE that existed before he was
None.
there.
That's right.
And you can like or dislike what Welch made, but there was a new company there at the end of his term, and then it happened again after the financial crisis.
Chrysler and Iacocca.
Yeah, Chrysler has had this happen. U.S. Steel has had this happen a bunch of times. You could see that kind of thing happen to the United States, and that's kind of the hope that a Trumpian figure provides.
Yes, that was the hope in Trump during the swamp, right? He would do an Elon Musk and just fire everybody, and we would hit the reset button.
Yes, and obviously Trump himself is not able to do it. No. But maybe you put Trump in prison, and 10 years from now, somebody stands up and decides that they're actually going to be a Franco figure, and they're going to do that. And that could happen.
It could, and that could be a thing, and that's a possibility. There's a lot of possibilities right now, right? And one of the things that I try to get, when in writing my Substack, is getting people thinking. So we're in this kind of waiting period, right? So I say, try to think of the regime in this religious nature, right? So it has its own telos, its own ethos. So if you're looking to be outside the system, you have to provide a contrast to the system. So part of the thing is to begin thinking about what would life be like if I lived it outside of the system? How would my life be different if I didn't worship the state? How would my life be different if I had a different relationship with technique? How would my life be different if I had a different relationship with people? And is that possible, and how do I get there? how do I, because the technical system is inherently alienating. It's as Heidegger says, it enframes us, it encloses, cuts us off from each other, but also cuts us off from the created world. So how do I then reintegrate myself into human relationships and a real relationship with the created world around me? So how can I begin to do that, think like that? And it might be that some of these incubators become the hot spots where people then say enough is enough, right? Or maybe not, or you just simply are prepared to live a different way.
I mean, there's at that level, at the level of your own life, you've got executive power. Hopefully at the level of your family's life, you've got executive power.
Well, and your church community and your neighborhood, that there are levels that these things can be done in preparation for the big one that's going to happen.
Well, even not so much not necessarily in preparation, but because you want to live better, right?
That's right.
So the problem we're discussing here is the universalizing and utopian nature of techness has reached a point where there's negative returns on the iterations.
That's exactly
and so
it.
You might want to, so you could take executive action to restore a different kind of life at the level at which you're able to execute executive power. And obviously nobody on this call has the ability to do that at the national level, but there are levels at which you probably have that authority.
Yeah, like your local church might be a place, you might, there's groups, you know what I mean? Maybe at the municipal level, at the township or whatever, there's an opportunity, especially if you're more rural and smaller, to actually do some of these things. But then the next step is, how do you create the disruptions necessary to?
Well, yeah. So there's layers to this. So when we're speaking on this platform, mm-hmm. there's a couple of things we're doing. First, we're advising people how to live, and in advising people how to live, we're talking about like, what can you do? What executive action can you take in your own the sphere that you're bounded in?
It's almost pastoral.
That's right. Sense. And that's one element. And the other element of what we're doing is we're talking about politics and history. And if we're talking about politics and history, we're talking about what to expect in the foreseeable future. And in that sense, I think the right has a historical obligation to set forward a path. Like setting forward Caesarism that's the example of wipe the slate clean inside mm-hmm. the existing bureaucracies. There's two other ways forward that I think the right needs to sort of aesthetically needs to express. The first of these is the break up the empire solution. Mm-hmm. And this is the world in which the United States politics does not break out in the U.S. government, or it does and it's suppressed. Mm-hmm. And you have the technical system go on for some period of time. Then all politics is anti-imperial politics.
Yes.
So if you're in a place like South Africa, if you're in a place like Spain, if you're in a place like Canada, all mm-hmm. politics is about resisting the empire and keeping the empire out.
Yes.
Right. And stopping the empire from destroying the thing that you love.
It's similar to what Calvin talks about in the Institutes, where the lower magistrate has an obligation, when the higher magistrate is oppressive, to rebel against the higher magistrate for the good of his people. And that's
right. But and even at like a larger level, you have to realize that if the U.S. empire limps on in this fashion much longer, they're going to reach a stage where they're no longer able to control their vassal states.
Well, right? And it's like a good question might be this, right? So we're running into an energy crunch, right? It's one of these things. At what point does Canada say, oil is a finite resource. We have lots of it. We're just going to keep it for ourselves because this is good for our people. Sorry, bye. Right, and that's a provocative action. right? And then the Americans would have a choice to make, which would be, well, do we invade Canada and secure the oil, or not, right? And does Canada have a plan to repel them? These.
Well,
but that would be one of these kind of actions. It's
but again,
it's sort of
like anti-imperial politics is situationally like.
Yes.
We discussed this at the outset. The future of where Canada is not an imperial state is
that's
very,
exactly
very
it. It's
far
just
away.
not happening. It isn't going to happen.
But if you're South Africa, the future where you're not an imperial state is basically right now.
Yes.
Right. And if there's like dozens of these places around the world that foreseeably in the next 10 years could become, instead of vassal states, something else. And so that's kind of area number 2. If you're not going to have a Caesar to revitalize the American empire, the next layer down is, okay, anti-imperial politics. If the empire is going to be evil, then it would be best if the empire sheds as much of its power as it possibly can.
Yes. The other option, one of the other options that I would see would be, from an active point of view, would be kind of the Taliban option, is to is making yourself ungovernable, right? And so this would be the internal civil war type option, right? Where the empire may be stronger than you are, but you can basically make yourself ungovernable.
Yeah, so this is path number 3, right?
That's right.
So there's anti-imperial politics as kind of path number 2, and then there's this kind of parallel insulate yourself from the empire somehow,
and then make yourself ungovernable from the empire.
Well, but ungovernable means that you're insulated from their power.
That's right.
That's what it.
From their
that's
rewards,
what it means.
from their rewards and punishments. That's right.
Yes, and so this is the option that I don't think the right has really explored in discourse at all.
No.
Anti-imperial politics, there are people doing that. Caesarism, there are people who have talked about that, though I think it would be better if it was talked about, the Musk Twitter thing is a great example of how Caesarism could be done well.
Mm-hmm.
And there's drawbacks and positives to that, but I think on balance, everyone would agree that getting rid of 99% of all employees of the U.S. federal government would be a net positive for the world.
But your Social Security check wouldn't show up on time.
Well,
that is actually an example that Alul uses, is that, your social, the functional equivalent, the French equivalent of your Social Security check will not show up on time.
Well, that's right. But on the other hand, your grandchild won't have his dick chopped off. So,
which way, modern
choices.
man?
And I think that's the right way to frame that. Like the empire's got this crappy reward that it can still give you, but on the other hand, you have to be evil, and there's a time for choosing.
Yes, and the empire is really built and predicated upon its ability to provide rewards, which is one of its organizing principles of using technique and control to generate money, right? And that's system-wide. And so as soon as they can no longer do that, as soon as, that's when things will begin to get real.
Right, but the mistake that is made, the U.S. empire is the richest empire that has ever existed.
Yes.
They're running through capital relatively quickly, but there's a long way from way that the average American lives to a state where, people start attempting the IRA solution, right?
Yeah. Or the Taliban solution.
Yeah, it's a very, very long way.
We are not close to that.
We've talked about this in the Canadian context. Like, we're just at a tipping point now in this country where the ability to take talented young men from their local community and promise them rewards in places like Toronto or New York is starting to be like, the promise is starting to seem a little bit hollow now.
Well, and they know it, right? Because now you've been made to visibly compete against people from everywhere, right? You've got the labor pool and the competition pool has amped up.
But that the competition pool really isn't the problem. The problem is the success condition, right? Their problem, the reason they're having more and more trouble getting, because you're not worried about whether some midwit buys in, you're worried about whether the next Jeff Bezos buys in, or whether he like stays in rural, I don't know where Bezos was born, but if he stays in like rural Montana and does something awesome there instead, right? You want him to buy into your system and be part of the empire. And the way you do that is by promising him all these awesome rewards if he ups and leaves his life and becomes part of the empire. The problem is all the people who are like visible symbols of the empire all have terrible lives. And so high agency young men are less and less attracted to it. So like, yeah, Jeff Bezos gets to be the richest man in the world, but he has to write a $20 billion check to his ex-wife. Because I don't know, she decided she was tired of him or something.
Well, what was interesting, to go back to like the trucker dispute, is seeing that firsthand. Is that what you saw there, especially for guys who are stuck in BS jobs, pushing paper or doing spreadsheets, is that here you had a group of people who looked competent, organized, committed, and relatively happy with who they are.
Yeah, well, and that's the other thing that the regime can no longer promise. They can no longer promise that you get to be proud of who you are, especially if you're a white man. Right?
Yeah, and so you had here all of these guys, as truckers there, and it opened a window in a sense to a kind of life like, oh yeah, like everything used to be kind of like that, where people were competent and happy and organized, and what went wrong?
Well, but this is what I'm getting at. We have to open that window in our disparate communities, right? Redeemer has to be that window, right? Into a world that's different.
That's correct.
Right. For those who don't know, Redeemer is like a
Christian liberal arts university.
It's a Christian university in Southern Ontario that is highly associated with a particular community.
Yes.
And so the point we're trying to get at is the regime's ability to offer rewards to young men, especially white young men, is really declining because of, for a whole variety of reasons. They're well documented.
Yes.
And so we're just kind of at a tipping point where there's a larger fraction of men that you can convince and say, maybe you don't have to join the evil empire. Maybe it would be better for you not to do that.
Well, and here's the thing, like, you can say to them, you know what, you might have a comfortable, you're not going to make as much as you would on Wall Street or Bay Street, right? And,
but maybe you get to have a wife and children.
Well, that's it. And you're going to be part of us.
Maybe they'd respect you instead of hate you.
Yeah. And see, this is one of the things that the public-private split that's been foisted on us for churches and so forth is so devastating, right?
Oh my goodness!
The idea that when you think of churches like, oh, it's about getting saved, or it's like the pietist thing about meeting God, right? But if you're looking at building a well-rounded community, a parallel polity, like say being in the world but not of the world, like a community of Christ. Well, what do you need to form a full community? Well, you need families, okay, but in order to form families, you need jobs. And in order to have jobs, you need businesses, right? And so all of a sudden you can begin to see putting together all of these pieces where Christians can found businesses, give people a place to work.
What you first and foremost need is you need your high-quality young men not to leave
That's right. And you got to give them a reason not to leave, that there's opportunity.
Yes.
The opportunities are here. They may not be a Bay Street or Wall Street opportunity. They might not be an Ottawa or a DC opportunity, but they are a real opportunity. You will be able to build a wife. You will have a house. You'll have a wife. You'll have kids, and you will have a stable relationship in your community.
And your life is actually going to be better here than it is going to, like, it. You should just be running like the squalidness of progressive life in the big cities on repeat reel all day long.
Yeah, and you could say, and listen, we can do it here in a parallel community that maybe it's at the edge of the suburbs. It's an exurb, or or the latest in that IM 1776 thing about picking up land in urban Detroit. Maybe we can just go in and take a whole bunch of urban land off of Detroit from them and just colonize Detroit. Just crazy ideas this way. But the idea is that you can then, you're giving an existential reward of saying, not only are you going to be able to form a family and have a decent life, but you're going to be part existentially of
this great story.
You're going to build something.
Yeah.
Your grandchildren are going to be talking about how you built this community.
Well, like my favorite Charlie Brown cartoon of all time is the Thanksgiving special, where they talk about the Pilgrims crossing the Atlantic, fleeing persecution. Like, there's this story that Americans used to tell themselves that, Americans don't even remember that they told themselves this story about who they were as a people and the contribution to that they could have to this, like, what was kind of subtextually compared to a journey to the promised land. Right.
Yes, we can carve a land out for ourselves and be our own lords. In a sense, like we don't have to live under the thumb of some who's telling us to worship in a way that we don't want to worship. And so we can go here, we can worship God the way that we want to. We can build something, and we can govern ourselves.
Yes, and we can tell that story all over again.
We can, and that's what we. Yes, that's exactly it, Black Horse. That we, and that's really the reward that we have to sell to be, that you are going to build something. And again, the reason why I keep saying that,
well, you've got three pieces of propaganda. You've got, by the way, these people who are promising you rewards to betray your community and join the empire, they're lying to you because the life they're offering you is disgusting. So that's element one of your propaganda.
Yeah. You'll have to sell your soul for a diminishing asset, a job that's not going to be worth what you think it's going to be worth.
And then element two of your propaganda is, by the way, look at the kind of family that you could have if you didn't leave. Like, you could have, like, real male friends. Male friends aren't part of progressive world.
Yeah. And your real male friends, you could do things together, like, build houses for people in the community. Gather together.
You could participate in the power process. Let's put it that way.
That's right. When old widow so and so needs a new roof, you just band together and she's got a new roof.
Well, yeah, and your children could look up to you, and your wife could respect you, and you could not have a divorce rate of 60%, and like you could live that life. And then part number three of the propaganda that you can present is you can present this unified story going back hundreds of years to, this is the project of your great-great-grandfathers, and it will be the project of your great-great-grandsons.
Well, and even more so, like even deeper, and again, we talk about the religious nature of the regime. You can say, and this is why I say, but really, where is the thing that can potentially offers that kind of religious core, which is the Christian faith? So you have this. We have this story now. Ours is actually the older story. We go all the way back to creation, at least to Christ. We can say, and this is, because this is what Christ did, right? He gathered his disciples together and taught them how to found a community. And so we're basically just going to do what Christ did, and we're just going to hit a reset button, and we're going to build a holistic community that provides for the full rounded needs of its people.
Well, and to this end, I think the propaganda piece that needs to be hit over and over again are these moments in Western history where these founding moments. So, I've done a number of threads looking at images from the crowning of Charlemagne to like draw back on Western history. When was the last time a new king was crowned in a new place?
Mm.
And what would it take to re-enchant the world to make you believe that you could found a new ethnos?
Well, you look at the beginning of the West, right? We talk about pre-moderns. We think pre-modern and we think like mud huts, right? Okay,
no,
right at the cultural beginning of the West, right around the year 1000, and shortly thereafter, what were they building? They were building 100-foot high cathedrals out of stone using hand tools.
Yes,
right.
And they were taking like 6 lifetimes to do them.
Yeah, and your commitment, so you'd have this small village, and this church would tower over everything, right? Well, this is a society that is energetic. It's filled with faith. There's a passion there, right? So, maybe we don't build cathedrals, but there is something else that we can then build. We can have and it can be tied into our Christian faith, and it can be apart from and separate from the regime.
Okay,
and its logic.
Okay, so we're almost done, but we have a friend of the show who wants to speak. Laurentine, how are you doing?
I think his mic is off. Of course he is. Yeah,
there we go. I'd correct you. The pronunciation is Laurentian. Laurentian elite.
Yes, there we go.
Coin.
The hated Laurentian elite.
Laurentian elite.
Do we need to ban you from the show here?
Immediately.
You could, but I'd find a way to ban you back. So that's how we work here.
Go.
Oh yeah, mutual self-assured destruction, right?
That's right. Yeah. That's what we're about.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I'd just like to introduce some terminology, and that something that I've heard before in these terms is 2 things: is the creation of public good. So in order to create obedience, you would in turn have to create an idea of public good, that you are providing public good. And that is something that we see a failure of amongst the regime. The regime is no longer able to provide public good, and that may be...
Well, I actually think that one step before that, to create a public good, or a sense of public good, you have to create a sense of public, right? Which is why I go back to these founding moments in the early, basically between 800 and 1200 AD, where you see the founding of peoples and nations all over the West. So in Canada, outside of Quebec, what people do you belong to if you live in Southern Ontario? Well,
no comment.
Yeah, no comment. It's probably
no comment because nobody knows, right?
Well, but at the same time, Laurentian is getting at a point, though, if you look at it differently, because in the PMC striver world, everybody's talking about leadership all the time, but really the essence of the charismatic leader, the king figure, is his ability, and this was we talked about this before, was the ability within himself to make decisions that then benefited those who sustained his power.
Yeah, but what you have to, a king can only be crowned by a community that's able to recognize.
That's exactly it, right?
Right. So, we're just peeking into the era where this can be done. So you might imagine that if there's another regime crisis like COVID in Canada, COVID in Canada saw the first kings crowned in Canada in the longest time, where you saw genuine leaders emerge that were attached to people. Mm-hmm. So who is Tim Stevens, right? Before COVID, Tim Stevens is the pastor of some random church in Calgary. Mm-hmm. After COVID, Tim Stevens is the leader of a people, and he doesn't even really understand it.
No, that's right.
And these are the moments that we're just at the edge of coming into, where people will find a sense of themselves and they'll appoint their own leaders and they'll attach themselves to them spiritually. This is possible for the first time. Maybe the last time this was done in the West is when what's his name? The famous Quebec nationalist. René Lévesque took the Quebecois people and made them something again after they kind of got a sense for themselves during the draft riots during World War One.
Mm-hmm.
But we're talking about the kind of thing that just hasn't happened very often in the West in a very, very long time.
No. Now, you said that you had a couple other points, Laurentian.
One I'd mention is obedience. So public good, when you create public good, you create, you're looking to create obedience. And that is something that's very foreign, I think, to today's culture and today's people. Mm-hmm. So our public isn't used to obedience, not to God, not to anything. However, they find themselves being lured into the state, and the state creates obedience through the projection of public good, which is deteriorating.
They're also like the state has figured out that if your command toward quote public good is to tell everyone do as that wilt, then you can create a sense of obedience relatively easily. It's why it's such an uphill battle for them to do. It's why they can't call on anyone to sacrifice anymore, right?
Very true. The only other point I'd add is Christopher Dawson's book that I'm reading. Religion and the Rise of Western Culture. There's a point, and it's after the fall of the Roman Empire, and where there was monks that were basically dispersed throughout the remaining empire, and really what it started with, what the public good started with, was a monk tilling a garden next to a forest. So the monk would be working the ground and bring people together, and eventually in 50 years they'd have a modest monastery of some kind. So two things. It's happened before, mm-hmm. and it will happen again, and we have the capacity within ourselves and with God's guidance in order to get ourselves out of it again. So that's the positive, but it's a very simple act of tending a garden is maybe where it could start.
Yeah, I was just looking now while I was listening to you through some of the notifications and replies on the thread, and there was someone named Barend asked a question on, what about the Amish, right? And what could we learn from them? Now, there's the biggest thing that you can learn from the Amish, and especially the better ones, is the intentionality of the relationship to technique. But the one thing that we should pay attention to with the Amish, especially, is the non-violence of the Amish, in that the Amish community exists at the sufferance of the regime. So the Amish are allowed to do their thing because they're not a threat, right? And so you have to remember that the option to be non-violent, if you are successful, and the Amish will have reached this point eventually where they're a threat, and then they will discover that that they no longer have the sufferance of the state, and they will be crushed, right? And so you have to be prepared for that.
but I mean, the Amish have been there before, right? So if you go back to like Canada during the World Wars, where the Amish attempted to become conscientious objectors, they fully understand that part of the choices that they have made means that they'll be beaten up by the state whenever the state comes into conflict with.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Finds them objectionable. So that kind of separation, it has been possible because Western states have broadly, like, the Amish basically only exist in Canada and the United States. They don't exist anywhere else. And they exist in Canada and the United States because the better judgment of those governments over the last 300 years has said, leave these people alone and buy their food and ignore them otherwise, because it's better to live with men than kill them. Well, in the history of Western governments, there's a lot of times where the idea of it's better to live with men than kill them kind of breaks down.
Well, yeah. And the thing that has to be remembered is that Amish nonviolence depends upon the violence of the American state or the Canadian state, and we have to understand that even if you don't have a boot to your neck, this is one thing that Alul noted, that a lot of our economic relationships, things like propaganda, are inherently violent. They just don't draw blood. Right?
Yeah.
And so the Amish exist in nonviolence because of the violence of the American state, right? And that's something that I think that a lot of time is elided. And so there is a high road. This is something that he made, that actually Alul made very explicit in his book on violence, that and use the Amish as an example, that they really exist. And so this idea of the Amish option, that we can kind of have this peaceable country sort of existence without technology, is fine as long as you are willing to accept the power of the regime over you and the violence of the regime that creates and allows you to have this space.
Well, and not on the violence of the regime that will eventually be directed at you when the regime breaks down too far.
That's exactly it, right? Because you're prosperous, and they will look to loot you because you're an easy target.
Yeah, eventually, and it's just a question of how far things get, and that's what I was getting at in discussing. Like, Canada and the United States have been enormously prosperous nations for a very long time, and so they've been able to completely ignore these people. But there will come a day when that's no longer so, when they'll stop ignoring them. They'll, do all kinds of nasty things to these people.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate, and it's, no one likes to think of these alternatives, right? But the Amish question is a good one because this is one thing about Alul is he's a Calvinist, and Calvinists tend to be sort of that unsuperstitious kind of cold reason sort of thing, bloodless. Yeah, the kind of this as I talked about with Auron, it takes technocrats to instantiate a revolution. Unfortunately, many of those revolutionaries were bloodless Calvinists, and so you have to realize that the Amish option. Yes, we have to still reconsider our relationship to technology, but if you want to be serious about dealing with the state, you have to recognize that unless you choose martyrdom, and that's a valid path for a Christian, that you are going to have to come to grips with violence. All states, in a world of sin and evil, all states are founded on violence and maintained by violence.
But bottom line, like Romans 13, anyone who grabs sovereignty has an obligation to have a positive relationship with violence.
That's right, because you are God puts you there as a king to defend the people and to punish wrongdoers, and that's right. In a sinful world, that is the lesser of two evils. It doesn't make it any less evil, and God will still hold you accountable for your actions, but that's the task that you have been given, and so you embrace it. But
bottom line, like, you can have whatever moral judgment you want to have, but you have a clear directive in revealed scripture, and you have enormous history.
That's
so, right. Whatever you want to think about it, that's what it is.
That's exactly it. Yeah. So, and this is the one thing that, in a sense, the Amish community, you have to.
They attempted to reckon with this way back, like 700 years ago, when they were driven out of Europe through this like incredibly bloody process, and then they've, been fortunate not to have to deal with it since.
That's right.
The days are coming.
They are,
because the empire in which they live is decaying, and you just have to talk to a white South African to find out what happens when a state collapses.
Yeah, or what is it, Rhodesia?
Yeah,
we've seen this play before.
When I was a kid, my church, my pastor was a former South African, and there were 3 families there who were white Rhodesians, who, the land that their family had traditionally owned certainly no longer belonged to them. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, you leave in the middle of the night and you pack in the car and you just go. And you figure out the rest later when you get there.
Yeah. So, these things happen.
They do.
All right. Well, it's pretty late. Is there anything else we want to touch on before we
I think this is good. I mean, there'll be other chances to chat, and like you say, it's like 11:30 already. And except for Big Tuna, who's there on the West Coast, so it's like 8:00 for you. So you get to enjoy the rest of your evening, sir, after listening to us. So, but yeah. Anyways, we'll call it. Thank you all for showing up, for listening, and being patient. And it was really good to chat with you, Black Horse, and I look forward to doing this again.
Yep. Enjoy your night.
Yeah, you too. Yep, bye-bye.